I'm uh, I'm going to introduce this because it's going to be recorded, and that would be perhaps a benefit to those people that watch the recording. So, on behalf of the board of Anderson Forum for Progressive Theology, I welcome you to this Bible study event tonight. And as you know, this is a preparatory study for the event that we are hosting in 2 Saturday evenings on Saturday, October the 28th, which will be a one-man dramatic presentation called Meaningless by Rodney, Brazil, right there on the screen, based on the book in Hebrew scripture called the Book of Ecclesiastes. It's a book that scholars and rabbis have studied and debated for hundreds and even thousands of years. Who wrote the book? When was it written? Where was it written? And most of all, why in the world was it written? And should it even be in the Bible? Or does it say something really important to us across all time, to human beings everywhere? Our study leader tonight is Bible student and Bible teacher David Johnson. He conducts a Zoom Bible study every Monday evening, and he's agreed for the Bible study this Monday evening to be on this book of Ecclesiastes so that we will be better informed as we go to the event by Rodney on the 28th. And I surely hope that all of you and others will come on that Saturday, the 28th. It will be at the Market Theater Company on Federal Street, 110 Federal Street in Anderson at 7 o'clock that evening. And because of artistic considerations, we will not be recording it as we usually do and post it on our website. The seats are free, but as always, all of your gifts go toward our getting speakers and speaker-related expenses. And it will not be recorded, but this session tonight will be and is being recorded so that we can post that on our forum website, which is Anderson Forum for Progressive Theology.org. It's the first letter of each one of those, AFPT.online.org. Just Google that and you find it. David is a volunteer like I am and like everybody else related to the forum. We're all volunteers. We thank Stuart Sprague at Boulevard Baptist Church for being our host tonight, and Doug Davison is helping him. David, thank you. We turn it over to you, and we appreciate your time and your study and your preparation and bringing us this enlightening study, and I'm sure it will be, shall I say, meaningful.
Okay, well, thank you, and welcome everybody. I have been teaching Bible study classes and theology classes and religious history classes for a long time, but I also was involved in theater for a long time, and I am fascinated by what we're going to see on the 28th. So, Rodney, we're looking forward to it. I can't quite imagine how you're going to do this. I'm anxiously awaiting. If you will mute yourselves, click on the little mute button, then our screen won't jump around, and I am going to switch it to speaker view. And so now what I have is Mary's phone. That may not work. That may not work. Okay, well, let's go back to the gallery then. All right. When I begin a Bible study, I typically start with some introductory stuff about procedure. You know, how do we go about this? How do we tackle this text? And certain questions are almost universal. You almost always start off by asking some of the same questions that Steve just mentioned. These questions are not about the text itself, or they're not about the content of the text. They are kind of a
Mm-mm.
Can't hear you, David.
the host muted me. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So the questions are not about the content of the text. The questions are about the text as a historical document. And I want to go through that. It's going to take just a couple minutes of our time, but I think it's important to kind of focus any study, and especially one where I'm going to try to do this in 30 to 40 minutes so that we have time for some discussion. I mentioned before we started to Peter that it's real easy to teach Ecclesiastes in 5 or 6 hour long sessions. When I was asked to do this, I thought, oh, no problem. I've taught Ecclesiastes 3 or 4 times, and then okay, I'm going to do it in 30 minutes. Well, that's a much more difficult proposition. I spent some time taking all the material I had on Ecclesiastes and trying to narrow it down. But I want to start with these 4 basic questions that I usually apply to any text. And the first question is, who wrote it? And we can almost never know with any real specificity who wrote it, but there are usually internal clues that can tell us some things about the author. Um, there's almost always a traditional, and if you're not watching, I'm making air quotes, a traditional answer to that question, such as Moses wrote the Torah. Well, scholars almost always have a different view of who wrote it, and so we would always want to examine who we think probably wrote this text. The second question is, when was it written? And again, we usually can't know with any real specificity, but there's usually, again, internal evidence that suggests a date, or a rough date. An example of that would be the Gospels. We know those were written 4 to 7 decades after Jesus's death, and we typically date the Synoptic Gospels, for example, around the 70 A.D. mark, the Roman War, when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed. And the answer to that question also helps to direct the analysis of the text. And those two lead us to the third and fourth questions. They are related. The third question is, for whom was it written? It's important to realize that writing something like a book of the Bible, writing something as detailed and difficult and artistic as much of that writing is, had to have some kind of serious motivation. There was some reason behind it, and that reason was there's something that needed to be said to the community to which that text was directed. It is a mistake to go into a Bible study thinking that the Bible was written for us. Although obviously there are things we can learn from the biblical texts, all of them were written for a specific audience. Most obvious illustration of that in the Hebrew scriptures, I think, are the prophets. They were written to a very specific time, very specific community. They were written for a very specific purpose based on what was going on at the time, and to a very specific community. Sometimes the Israelites at large, sometimes to a smaller group. But an example from the New Testament would be Paul's epistles. They were written to, except for Romans, they were written to a specific Christian community which was having its own growth problems, and he was addressing those problems. And so it's a mistake to think that it was written to us. The fourth question is related to that, and that is, what were the historical and cultural conditions in the community for which the text was written at the time it was written? Because that's not necessarily the same thing as the setting, especially when you're dealing with stories. The setting of a story may be quite a bit different from when the story was written. And so those historical and cultural conditions also help to direct in any biblical analysis. A good example of that is the protest book of Ruth. I don't know how many of you have done much study of the book of Ruth. I find it one of the most fascinating stories. It's almost like a gotcha story. It was a protest book. Now, the story of Ruth takes place in probably around 1050 BC, but it wasn't written until 500 years later. And the situation was this: the the people of the Babylonian exile realized that the only way they could maintain an identity as a separate culture, to not merge with their captors and other people that were probably captives in Babylon along with them, was to remain culturally separate, to remain identifiably culturally different. And that meant that they adopted all of those reform practices from the period of King Josiah, the 7th century BC, and those were things like circumcision and observance of the Sabbath and kosher dietary restrictions. They were presented at this time as divine mandates, not just a good idea, but the law. And so that kept them separate from their Babylonian captors, kept them from merging. Now, that call for purity, when the exile ended and they came back to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah, they sort of evolved that thinking of what it meant to be pure to ethnic purity. And so there was a movement at the time to purge the community of anyone who wasn't considered ethnically pure. That meant mixed marriages. One of the spouses had to go. Children of those mixed marriages were deported. So ethnic purity came to be the way they understood that. Along comes this protest book of Ruth. And Ruth was a foreigner. She was a Moabite. The Moabites were traditional, well, they were sort of distant cousins of the Israelites, but of the Judean people, but they were enemies most of the time through history. And she was a Moabite, but she married a Judean, and so her husband died, the father died, and so Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi come back to Naomi's land. So Ruth is a foreigner, a Moabite, and she ends up being a very likable character. She saves her mother-in-law. She's a credit to her community, and so on and so forth. It's a nice story. However, the punchline is at the end when we discover that she and her husband Boaz are the great grandparents of King David. And the point of that story, the gotcha part of it, is that King David then would not be pure enough to remain a part of the community at the time that Ezra and Nehemiah were insisting on this ethnic purity. So when it was written becomes a far more important question than the setting of the story. When we apply these questions to Ecclesiastes, we immediately run into some stumbling blocks. It's one of those texts that you just don't have good answers to these questions. So first, who wrote it? Well, tradition says Solomon. And there actually is a little bit of internal evidence to claim that. Before I get into that, let me just mention, and this is one of the places, Rodney, where I'm very curious to see how you'll handle this. The book of Ecclesiastes speaks in two voices. There's the voice of the narrator that opens the book, just the first verse, And then that narrator's voice comes back at the end. The bulk of the book is in the voice of this character called Kohelet. And Kohelet is not a common name. Kohelet is actually a Hebrew word that means one who gathers people. And so it's often translated into our English Bibles as preacher, but it could also be translated teacher, or a political figure, or I don't know, Taylor Swift. Anyone who gathers people together would be identified with this word in Hebrew. And by the way, Ecclesiastes is the Greek translation of that word. So in the first verse, the very first verse, the author introduces this character, the words of the preacher of Kohelet, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, of course, Solomon was the son of David and followed David as the king in Jerusalem. But, does king in Jerusalem refer to Kohelet, or does it refer to David? It's not really clear here in this verse, but later on, Kohelet clears it up in verse 12. He says, I, the preacher, I, Kohelet, have been king over Israel in Jerusalem. So we have this claim from the character in this presentation that he has been king in Jerusalem. Sounds like Solomon, doesn't it? Well, maybe. But David had 19 named sons. He had 2 that died in infancy, so we can't count those. But 19 named sons. And on his deathbed, David named Solomon as his successor to the throne. But there were at least 2 other sons, Adonijah and Absalom, who had a rightful claim to be the heir to the throne. So could Kohelet maybe be one of them, or one of the other sons? Maybe. Here's another possibility. The word son is often used, son, father, all those relationship terms are often used, especially in the Hebrew scripture, not to mean a literal son or a literal father. People would say things like, you sons of Jacob, sons of Israel. Well, that doesn't mean the 12 sons literally. It means male descendants of Israel, right? Or Abraham, your father. Well, he wasn't your father, biologically speaking, but he was your male predecessor. So it could be that the word son refers to some other male descendant of David. So could it have been another king? There's a whole line of kings that descended from David. It could have been one of them that wrote this text. So could have been Solomon, could have been a different son of David, or it could have been some other male descendant of David. But there's a fourth possibility, and that is that it could have been a literary creation of the author, that this isn't a real person. This is a literary device. It's a fairly common literary device. If you have something you want to say that's going to be controversial, then maybe don't say it yourself. Maybe put it in the mouth of some fictional character who said it. It's not me that said it. It's this character that I created. So it's a common literary device, and it could be that Kohelet is exactly that. So we don't do any better when we move on to the second question. When was it written? Other than the claim by the author and by Kohelet, there is no evidence really that it was written at the time of Solomon. There is, however, internal evidence. You'll hear some of it tonight. You may already be familiar with it. That this guy's thinking was influenced by Greek philosophy. And that causes some scholars to argue for a much, much later date, maybe the 3rd or 4th century BC. Well, that's a 500-year difference between Solomon and the 3rd century. So that's quite a span. That doesn't narrow it down very much. And then the questionable identity of the author and the questionable um, uh, time when it was written means that questions 3 and 4, for whom was it written and what were the historical and cultural context in which it was written, those are unanswerable. We can't really make even any educated guesses about that. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the text itself. That's really all we have. There's nothing in those 4 basic questions, kind of a standard way to approach a biblical text. That standard approach just doesn't get us very far. So we have to do a little more textual analysis. And so let's do some of that. The central message of this book, the central claim by both the author and by this character Kohelet, is hevel. And you may not be familiar with that term. It's a Hebrew word. I'm no Hebrew scholar, but I always make sure that I read to people who are Hebrew scholars to get this stuff straight. But hevel is a Hebrew word that is translated in the very beginning of this book, in the 2nd verse. It's translated as vanity. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. I always hear the background music, the song "You're So Vain." You probably think this song's about you. It's vanity to think, well, we'll get into what that verse means. But the other 38 or so times that the word hevel appears in this text, it's translated into English as meaningless, which happens to be the name of Rodney's presentation. But what I read about this word indicates that those translations don't quite capture the Hebrew meaning of the word. The Hebrew word literally means vapor, like smoke. It's insubstantial. There's really nothing there. On a cold morning, you can see your breath, but it dissipates very quickly as though it were never there. And if you try to grab it, it has no substance. And life, according to our text, is like that. All your efforts, all your accomplishments, all the things you think are important, all the things you strive to accomplish in your life are temporary and fleeting and insubstantial, like vapor, hevel. So Kohelet begins in verse 3 of that first chapter by asking, what profit do people have in all the toil at which they toil under the sun? So to put that in modern words, if life is evaluated as a business's balance sheet and death is the end of the fiscal year, what is the profit that's left over? What's the bottom line of your life? We've already been told in the previous verse that everything is just vapor, and it's vanity to think otherwise. Your life's efforts produce no profit. Kohelet later further answers that question when he says, just as you come from your mother's womb naked, so you will return, ending up just like you started. All your hard work produces nothing. Well, that's depressing, isn't it? Later on, Kohelet shifts his evaluative terminology, and I think this is really important. He shifts it from talking about profit, which is what's left over at the end, to reward. Think about the difference between profit and reward. By talking about reward, it gives him a way to overcome the the very depressing hopelessness that Hevel creates. Profit's what's left over at the end, but reward is something of value, even if it's only temporary and fleeting. Even though it won't last, it's something we can enjoy now. I like to think of it like a gift card that has an expiration date. You know, it has value to us now if we use it, but if you hang on to it, it's going to be worthless. So what is the value of life? What if there's no profit, maybe at least there is some reward, some value, even if it's temporary. So what is it? And that's really the philosophical question that Kohelet is attempting to answer. The words of Kohelet, the main body of this text, are bookended by a discussion of time at the beginning, death at the end. In the opening passages, verses 4-9, I think it is, in the first chapter, he says that time will eventually erase all memory of you. Even in your own family, by the third or fourth generation after you're gone, no one will remember you. No one will remember anything you accomplished. In modern terms, again, just a few days after your retirement party, somebody new is going to be sitting at your desk. At the end, he talks about death. And he says basically that powerful and weak, rich and poor, all of us will die. Our bodies will return to dust and our spirit returns to God. And that's good, sound Jewish theology, but it means that from the cradle to the grave, nothing we do really means anything. Nothing matters. It's Hevel. That's hard to take, isn't it? So life is a meaningless enigma. He uses that word, enigma. Can also be translated paradox. We spend our days toiling under the sun, and in the end, what do we have to show for it? He says it's like we spent our time chasing the wind. We seek to find meaning and purpose in life. We hope to make a lasting impact, but in the end, death is going to claim everyone. And in a very short while, no one will remember us at all. We made no impact. Hevel. We are just vapor. So, what, according to Kohelet, are these things that we pursue, these meaningless pursuits? Well, first he says we seek wealth. We build grand houses and we plant extensive vineyards. But eventually those houses crumble and the vineyards are taken over by weeds. Our work, our careers, everything we do that seems important to us doesn't last. I don't know if any of you have had this experience. I have. Return to a place where you used to work. You don't recognize the place. It's changed so much. And nobody there remembers you. You know, you spent years there thinking you were having a real impact on this business or this company or this institution. And after you've been gone for a few years, you come back. It's like you were never there. I used to attend a church that had along a hallway a wall of portraits. They had a portrait of every minister who had served that church since its founding in 1868. Now, I have no doubt, I've known a lot of ministers in my time, I have no doubt that a lot of those ministers thought that they were leaving a lasting legacy. They were building something important. Nobody will ever forget what they did in building this church up. But you walk down that hallway with the other people attending the church today, nobody knows who those guys were. Nobody knows what they contributed to the church. Oh, they might know the last 2 or 3, maybe 4 ministers there if they're old timers. But you go back to 1868, they have no memory of this person. They have no interest. They were chasing the wind, weren't they? Thinking they were having an impact, leaving a legacy. Hevel. Second thing Kohelet describes is pleasure. We seek pleasure. Well, that's certainly what gives our life meaning, isn't it? We work hard all week so that we have the weekend to party with our friends and our family and have a good time. But you know what? Monday always follows. Pleasure, Kohelet says, is fleeting. And in the long run, a life devoted to nothing more than seeking pleasure, the pursuit of pleasure, is meaningless. It's hevel. His third category, he says, the more noble among us spend our lives working toward justice. That's a noble cause. But the successes are only temporary. I think about our recent Supreme Court decisions, issues like civil rights and environmental justice. Have we really made very much progress? Ancient Israelites believed that God, excuse me, my phone's going off. Ancient Israelites believed that God rewarded the righteous and punished evildoers, not in some future existence, but in this life. But Kohelet looked around and saw that bad things happened to righteous people, to good people. And evildoers seldom had to face any comeuppance. They get away with it. The prophet Jeremiah wrestled with this issue when he asked the question, why do the wicked prosper? He was exploring the same question. Kohelet's version of that comes in chapter 9, where he says, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong. Look around. There is no justice in this life. Next category is the pursuit of wisdom. Kohelet admits that the pursuit of wisdom is better than the pursuit of wealth or might or power, but wisdom too is meaningless, because the words of the wise are very seldom heeded, and people who speak words of wisdom are often despised. So the pursuit of wisdom is also hevel, meaningless. So all these things that we chase after in this life, wealth and pleasure and justice and wisdom, they're all meaningless, and that is a very depressing thesis. Excuse me. Somebody, I must be really important. Somebody keeps there. So all these things are meaningless, and that's a depressing thesis. And so, what do we make of that? What do we make of that? Is it possible to find any value, any reward in life? What is the key to finding any satisfaction? Well, here is what Kohelet says is behind the paradox or the enigma of hevel. Acceptance of hevel, accepting that life is meaningless, is the way to find meaning in life. Okay. He uses some very strange poetic language, such as we must cast our bread upon the waters. No idea what that means. But if you go through all of these poetic analogies and metaphors, and make some sense out of what try to make some sense out of what Kohelet is saying, it seems that what he's saying is that we should act in spite of life's uncertainties, that we can find meaning by accepting that there's no meaning. Whatever happens in life happens. You can't change it. In spite of our efforts, it's going to happen. So just accept that. Know that to live life is to accept life's uncertainties. Just roll with the flow. Take what life hands you. Don't spend your time spinning your wheels trying to make something meaningful. In chapters 10 and 11, Kohelet explains that the gift of God is the enjoyment of life's simple pleasures, friendships and enjoyable work, good food and wine, a beautiful sunset. He says youth and health should not be ignored. They should be enjoyed because old age and death awaits us all. The benefit of trusting God rather than life's meaningless pursuits, chasing the wind, is that we are free to enjoy the days of our lives not as we wish them to be or as we foolishly try to make them, but simply as they come to us. That's the gift of God. I found one commentary writer that said, I love this statement. He says, the great tragedy of the human experience is not that our lives don't add up to anything that lasts, but rather the tragedy is that we fail to enjoy the life that's available to us because we're so busy trying to make our lives add up to something that will last. That is the paradox of Hevel. Now, any in-depth study of Ecclesiastes requires you to work through all of these rather bizarre metaphors and analogies, and Kohelet uses them to make the point. A large bulk of the writing is made up of these very strange poetic expressions. One commentary writer said, the poetry of Kohelet rises to soaring heights, though the symbolism is not everywhere clear. And that is an understatement. He talks about trees that fall in the forest, a lamp that goes out, streams that run to the sea. There's lots of animal imagery. He talks about dreams and kings, and there are quite a few very unclear proverbs. And that makes Ecclesiastes a wonderful topic for a group study, for a verse-by-verse study. Something we don't really have time to do tonight. The author takes over from Kohelet at the end of the book, and he offers what is a somewhat more theologically acceptable version of the point Kohelet is making. He says that the hope that remains after all this talk of Hevel is rooted in the confidence of God's ultimate judgment. That someday God will clear away all the Hevel and bring true wisdom and justice. And therefore, while we wait, we should live lives of honesty and integrity, trusting in God, even though we remain puzzled by life's mystery. Yeah. That's not exactly what Kohelet said, is it? God works in mysterious ways. Yeah, but that's not what Kohelet said. Let's go back to the question of when it was written. Jewish apocalypticism began to appear in the later prophets. They looked around and saw that there is no justice in this life. Bad people are not punished. Good people are not rewarded. And they had to come up with some way to understand that. Why is life like that? And so they began to look to a future age, a coming kingdom of God, when there would be judgment and destruction for the wicked, and the righteous would live on in perfect peace. You find Jewish apocalypticism in the later prophets. Eventually, this idea evolved in Christian apocalypticism to heaven and hell, right? An eternal life of reward or punishment. But Jewish apocalypticism didn't have eternal torment. It was just destruction. The wicked were just no more, just destruction. But from chapter 12, verse 9 to the end, what the author says sounds a lot like Jewish apocalypticism, referring to God's ultimate judgment. And that suggests one of two things: either a later date for the entire book, or that this is an addition, a later addition to a writing that existed before. Don't know the answer to that question. Then the last two verses of the book offer the authors, not Kohelet's, but the author's prescription for a meaningful life in spite of Hevel, with a nod to apocalyptic thinking. He says, "The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." My translation of that is that you shouldn't let your foolish pursuit of meaning in this life cause you to turn away from belief in and obedience to God. But again, that's not exactly what Kohelet said. But it is certainly a more acceptable, orthodox adaptation of what Kohelet said. And in fact, without that addition, it's very likely that Ecclesiastes would not have made it into the canon. Because what Kohelet said is really at odds with most of the rest of Hebrew scripture. So Kohelet's prescription for finding some sort of value, some sort of reward in life, has no reference to apocalypticism at all, no sense of God's judgment. But here's what he says. In light of Hevel, this is his summary of how to live a meaningful life. Go ahead, eat your food with joy, drink your wine with a happy heart, for God approves of this. Wear fine clothes with a splash of cologne. Live happily with those you love through all the meaningless days of life God has given you under the sun. The life God gives you is your reward for all your earthly toil. Whatever you do, do well. For there will be no work or planning or knowledge or wisdom in the grave, which is where you are headed. Well, I can't wait, Rodney, to see what you do with that. I would like very much now to just open it up for some discussion and comments. Let me just say that this was not intended to be an exhaustive study of of Ecclesiastes. This was just to whet your appetite for the big event coming up on the 28th. And after Rodney's performance, you will have a chance to ask people far better versed in biblical analysis than me some of the tough questions. But I thought, just in terms of the philosophy of life that's being presented here, to throw it out and say, what do you think of living your life this way?
I want to know. I want to know if everybody's thoroughly depressed.
Is everybody ready to commit suicide? I don't think so. I think that is a hopeless end. I mean, that is a hopeful ending. He starts off with this hopelessness, but I think there's a hopeful ending to this. That
all right. Let me ask this: should we, for the sake of those people that are going to watch it on the website, might we just turn off the recording now and let us do whatever we want to do, or what's your wisdom about that? The panelists, let me say this, that the panelists will include, of course, Rodney. So I don't know to what extent we want to do our grilling of him tonight, but I think we ought to save that for the panel.
Right.
But there will be a Buddhist educator and practitioner, and then a Hebrew Bible scholar, Peter Cohen, who is in one of the windows, who is retired or semi-retired from Clemson, the religion department, and the pastor of Boulevard Baptist Church, and then a United Church of Christ pastor. Those different faith and tradition perspectives will be represented on the panel.